All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. My name is Jane Lyons, and I am the Maryland Advocacy Manager with the Coalition for Smarter Growth. CSG is hosting tonight's webinar, and I am excited to be your moderator. If you're not familiar with CSG, we are an advocacy organization focused on creating walkable, inclusive, transit-oriented communities throughout the DC region. And we are hosting this event tonight about diverse neighborhoods as a part of CSG and our Montgomery for All Montgomery County grassroots group are All About Thrive series. Thrive 2050 is Montgomery County, Maryland's new general plan and will guide future growth and development for the next 30 years. It has sparked a lot of conversation around the question of how do we grow equitably? What are the housing and community development policies that will lead to a more just world? And this is a question that is a lot bigger than just Montgomery County, Maryland. So if you're joining us from outside of that jurisdiction, this conversation will certainly be applicable to your neighborhood and your jurisdiction as well. And we're glad to have you here. Although Montgomery County is a really unique place when thinking about diversity. The county has really rich diversity. It's home to several of the most racially diverse communities in the country. It's majority people of color and has a large foreign-born population. But of course, those are not the only ways that a place can be diverse. We'll mostly for tonight focus on racial and ethnic diversity and economic diversity. But there's also age diversity, religious diversity, gender and sexual orientation diversity, a diversity of abilities, and so much more. And Montgomery County is a place where certainly all of those different types of diversity are alive and well. But however, we as a county remain largely segregated, primarily racially and economically. Is that by choice, or is that an outcome of unequal policies and discrimination? And housing, neighborhoods, the built environment, the things that we're going to talk about tonight are only a part of that story about how we've ended up with the neighborhoods and community makeup that we currently have, but it's certainly an important part. So tonight you will hear from three amazing speakers about the latest research on neighborhood diversity and its intersections with housing policy. Each speaker will give a short presentation, and then we will jump into a question and answer session. And that will include some questions that I've prepared, as well as your audience questions. At this point in the evening, you are not able to take yourself off mute or turn on your cameras or chat. So apologies there, but I do promise that the chat will be opened up after the presentations have been complete for you to ask questions about those presentations specifically and about the concepts that we're talking about in general. So that's it for my housekeeping. I'm going to go ahead now and introduce our first speaker for tonight, who is LaToya Thomas. She is the Housing Indicator Tool Policy Director at the Housing Association of Nonprofit Developers. She is also the principal and founder of Brick and Story, a consultancy focused on using intentional engagement, communication, and storytelling strategies to foster stronger communities and tell the stories of the built environment. LaToya obtained a Master's of Regional Planning and a Bachelor of Science in Urban and Regional Studies from Cornell University. Thank you so much for being here tonight, LaToya.
Thank you for having me, Jane. Pleasure to be with all of you this evening. So let me go ahead and share my screen and get us started this evening. All right, so as Jane mentioned, I'm LaToya Thomas, and I'm actually here tonight presenting on behalf of one of my clients that I've worked extensively with, and that is HAND, the Housing Association of Nonprofit Developers. Tonight's presentation will focus on housing affordability and why it matters for Montgomery County in particular. And this is going to be presented under the lens of the Housing Indicator tool, which if you're not familiar with it, you'll learn a little bit about that tool tonight as well. Just a little bit about HAND. If you're not familiar with the organization, HAND is a nonprofit membership collective with over 450 different organizations and change makers, ranging from real estate developers, both nonprofit and for-profit, to architects, to builders, to lenders, to attorneys, but who are all focused around production and preservation efforts for affordable housing in the DC metro area. As part of HAND's work, it's been focused on not only providing critical training opportunities for its membership, but in particular, more recently, centering racial equity as part of its work. And that's not just through its operations and practices, but also through the advocacy work that it's begun doing, and even through the trainings that it's imparting on its membership. It's also worked in more recent years to develop a voice to lend towards advocacy towards more affordable housing policies across the region. And it's really focused on trying to shift the conversation for how can we be doing business differently in order to meet the need for affordability that we see throughout this region. So just to level set us to the conversation tonight, when we talk about what affordable housing means and how we define it, the Department of Housing and Urban Development defines affordable housing as that which for which the occupant is paying no more than 30% of their gross income on their housing cost. And that includes your utility expenses as well. So this definition of affordability brings me to what we call the regional commitment. And so for those of you who are not familiar, back in 2019, a couple of things happened from a housing and regional policy standpoint. First off, the Urban Institute released a regional analysis of how many net new housing units would be needed across the region in order to meet the need projected by 2030. And so based on Urban Institute, they determined that a total of 374,000 net new housing units were needed, of which almost 80% of those units should be affordable to middle income households and below. Subsequently thereafter, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments adopted a series of regional housing targets that were based off of the Urban Institute's analysis. And those regional housing targets and regional commitments basically affirmed the COG's commitment to increasing affordability across all of the COG region. And then subsequently, HAND worked in partnership with COG to develop a housing indicator tool, which you'll learn a little bit about tonight. But this tool serves as a digital representation of the targets and also tracking our progress towards meeting those targets. You'll see a few snapshots of the tool here on the right. I'm not going to do a full demo tonight, but I will just cover a couple of high-level pieces about the tool and encourage all of you to take a deep dive into it later. So the housing indicator tool is a digital dashboard. We released the tool we're in 2022 now. So we released the tool initially in 2021 with 2019 and 2020 data. That data was compiled from housing surveys that were issued to the various jurisdictions that participated at that time. And when we first launched, we had 11 participating jurisdictions. We now have, I believe, about 15. The dashboards are really an accountability tool. So it helps us understand what the targets are, how those targets break down across all the jurisdictions in the region, and then based on the survey data that we get back from the various housing directors and planning directors, how each jurisdiction is doing in terms of meeting their production goals to hit those targets. We also focus not just on production data, but we also focus on what's part of your toolkit. So what are the different housing policies, be that inclusionary zoning policies or housing or dedicated housing trust funds or affordable homeownership programs? What are the various policies that exist and what combination of policies does each jurisdiction have in order to make their housing toolkit and their housing policies work to their fullest capacity? We've also been truly focused on making this link between housing and racial equity. We know, and Jane has mentioned this at the top of the presentations, that we see a lot of history in how the US in particular has come to where it is from an equity standpoint. If we look back at land use policy and we look back at housing policy, we know there is a link between those policies and what we see today in terms of where people live, who has access to housing, who has access to home ownership, who has access to economic mobility. And so it's really critical as part of the work that we do with HAND to make that link so that we all understand that these are not separate issues. They are all very much related. And last but not least, the housing indicator tool focuses on really clear calls to action for all sectors. Meeting the need for affordability is not just a public sector problem, it's an everyone problem. And so really thinking through and identifying what those calls to action are that the private sector or the public sector, philanthropy, and even someone who's a resident in a community can take in order to help meet the need. So one of the educational pieces that's really critical for the work that we're doing at HAND as part of this tool is to help folks understand who is impacted by housing affordability. And for those of you who may work in this space more regularly, we know that there's conversations that happen where the question comes up, well, why is affordable housing needed in my neighborhood? Why can't it be placed here? And so we really need to have an honest conversation about who's impacted by housing affordability issues. And it really impacts all of us. It impacts most of the people that we know who are in our families or who support our lives in some shape, form, or fashion. This chart just gives a brief overview of what typical annual earnings are for different professions that we all know. We probably all know someone in at least one of these professions. And what you're also seeing on the right is what percent of those professions are typically housing cost burden. And again, that means what percent of people in those professions in our region are typically paying more than a third of their income on their housing cost. And so we know that as incomes go down, the percentage of people that are more likely having challenges meeting their housing expenses goes up. We also ask the question of who can afford to live here. And we're going to take a little bit of a segue to the housing indicator tool for a moment, just to show you a new tool that we integrated as part of the tool this year for those of you who have not seen the tool, and that is our personas. And so we ask who can afford to live in this region. And I encourage all of you to check this tool out at your leisure. But what you see here are personas. So all of these faces are actually fictitious, but the data on all of these faces is factual and from census data. You can turn over any of these cards to get a profession, a marital status, age, annual income, and monthly housing cost. And then you will see the slider above here. As you slide this up or down, you can see as the monthly cost for housing goes up or down, who becomes housing insecure. And by the end of this, as you get up to the most expensive housing costs a month, which is $4,000, you'll see only one person, the CEO, is actually left and able to comfortably afford their housing, and they are not seen as housing burdened. So again, just trying to give some real perspective on the different people, again, that we all know in our daily lives, whether they are accountants or pharmacists or technicians, or construction workers or hotel clerks or firefighters, folks that impact our day-to-day. Are likely being affected negatively by housing costs in this region. Okay, so back to our presentation. So let's take a look at the local lens. What's happening in the county? So I mentioned this larger number earlier, 374,000 net new units. And so that number gets divided across all of the jurisdictions in the region. In the case of Montgomery County has to produce, at least its goal based on these targets, is that it would be producing 3,247 net new units per year to yield a total of 48,705 total net new units by 2030. I've put a little star by that number and a point below just to provide some clarity for those of you who might dive into the tool later, and even some of the charts we'll go through tonight. As part of the tool this year, we added the city of Gaithersburg and the city of Rockville to the participating jurisdictions, and they received their own dashboards this year. So if you look at the numbers in the tool for Montgomery County, you'll see lower numbers for Montgomery County's dashboard. You'll see 2,472 instead of the 3,247. And that is simply because those two cities, Gaithersburg and Rockville, have their own dashboards this year. So their housing numbers were actually deducted from Montgomery County's total for the purposes of doing the tool analysis. But the broader number for the entire county is the 3,247 per year, or 48,705 by 2030. So let's just take a quick look at some of the data from this year's tool. And you'll see all of these charts again as part of the housing indicator tool. So when we look at the amount of housing that's been built, right now you're looking at data from 2019 through 2021, you can see that Montgomery County is not hitting the target on an annual basis. It has been increasing its production, particularly in 2019, as COVID was just starting, it had a higher level of production. That number's gone down a bit, but it's trying to pick back up. And we've seen that trend across most jurisdictions as a result of COVID. We also know, and this is not just the case for Montgomery County, but really for many jurisdictions, that production is lagging substantially in the 50% AMI and below categories. And so this is, again, specific to Montgomery County, but when we look at other jurisdictions, we see a similar theme where you will see a large number of units that have been produced over time at 50% and above, and in some cases, even at 30% to 50%. In the case of Montgomery County, there's not been much production at all in the last 2 years for the lower income bands, and that's really below 50% AMI. There has been more preservation in that space, but not nearly as much production. And I'll also highlight again to the point around housing being housing cost burden that I referenced earlier in the presentation. We know that as your income goes down, the chances you're going to be more housing cost burden, have more a challenge trying to pay for your housing expenses goes up. And so that's why we really are trying to highlight this year in particular, the need to address those lower income bands and if we're providing enough housing to meet that need. We also know that there's been a loss of lower income households, and in particular in Montgomery County, which are seeing the bars on the left in the top graph, the bars on the left of the zero axis is basically showing that we've had a loss of households with incomes at 30 to 50% AMI, 50 to 80%, and even 80 to 120%. We are also seeing a loss in units priced below $1,500 a month. And so for those of you who might be in the rental market, as an example, we all know what you can and can't get for $1,500 a month generally in the region. So as you can see here from this chart, we're seeing a loss of those lower price point units. There's certainly been a gain in some of the higher priced units that have come online, but we're definitely seeing a loss of those lower price units. And again, we're thinking about who's the most impacted. It tends to be the folks that are workforce that are on that middle and lower income bands who are really feeling the crunch by not seeing wage increases and then seeing lower supply available at the price points they're looking for. We also looked at demographics. And so this particular category looks at housing cost burden by demographic group. And so we can tell that in Montgomery County in particular, nearly half of all demographic groups are housing cost burden. But that's particularly true for Black, Hispanic, Latinx, and households identifying as other races, where more than half of those households are paying more than a third of their income in rent. So just to wrap up, to take it back to a point that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation around each of our roles and this call to action. As we think about what we've reflected on with the data that we've learned in the HIT, and not just from Montgomery County, but really throughout the region, we think about all of our roles in this housing ecosystem. And so again, thinking about the public sector, we want to know, how is that housing toolkit really being leveraged? Is it fully being leveraged so that policy can truly support enough production to start to meet the need? For the nonprofit sector, can the missions of the nonprofits be aligned so that production and provision of services can really affect the need where it's needed most in the deepest levels of affordability? When we think about the private sector, and that includes large businesses, corporations, as well as smaller industry, How do we think about location of jobs? How do we think about wage increases? How do we think about any kind of direct investment in housing? We started to see that in Northern Virginia through Amazon and really throughout other parts of the DC region through the work of Amazon's fund. How do we also look for similar models? Philanthropy. How do we think about changing the space of philanthropy to really start deploying those dollars to meet production needs? And then, of course, the advocacy community and broader residents in the community. How can these individuals be armed with the policy needs so that they understand where to push towards action and not necessarily where to hinder the process to bring more units online? And I will wrap up and turn it back to Jane to introduce our next presenter. But thank you so much for your time this evening. And I'm just added the link here, hit.handhousing.org, where you can visit the tool and do a deep dive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, LaToya. That was fantastic. We are now going to go into the next presentation, which is going to be by Dr. Tracy Heddenlow. Dr. Tracy Heddenlow is a fellow at Brookings Metro. Prior to joining Brookings, Dr. Lowe was senior data scientist at the Center for Real Estate and Urban Analysis at the George Washington University School of Business and the director of research at the Rails to Trails Conservancy. Dr. Lowe is a graduate of DC Public Schools and holds a PhD in city and regional planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. All yours, Dr. Lowe.
Thanks so much for having me here tonight, Jane. Okay, let's get these slides up. How's that?
That looks great. Great.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so thanks for having me here tonight to share a little bit about the research that I do in my job at Brookings. I am actually primarily interested in commercial real estate, but I'm also interested in this sort of bigger question, in part because of my interest in commercial real estate. I'm interested in agglomeration economies and why cities and why regions. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of the work that I've done tonight on that question. So US regions today are obviously much bigger than they were several generations ago because we have had a huge amount of population growth as a country in the last 85 years. But in addition to population growth, US metro areas have also expanded greatly in terms of the amount of land area that they take up. So for a research project that I did in the early days of the pandemic, I looked at the US metro areas that contained what were at the time the top 50 US cities by population in 1950. So I took a look at those 50 cities, and today those cities are contained by only 42 metropolitan areas because some of these metro areas have gotten so big that they have kind of consumed what were multiple separate cities in 1950. For example, Dallas and Fort Worth are now in one metropolitan region. And so what I did when I looked at this is I looked at kind of these were the early days of even the idea of US suburbs and the existence of those as places to live. And so, you know, in 1950, what we can see on this graph is that, you know, these cities contained a majority of, these regions contained a majority of all of the US population. This is where most people in the US lived at that time. And within these regions, it was still just slightly true that most people overall lived in cities, including most white people. So city living was what a majority of people were familiar with at that time. But the suburbs were in existence by 1950. Obviously, we're in the post-war area of development here. And they were expanding very, very rapidly. And so what we see on the right-hand side of this graph is that between 1950 and 2018, which at the time that I did this project, that was the most recent year of data available, we can see that there was a really massive shift in the US population, which is that the huge amount of growth that has happened in the US over the last several generations has pretty much all happened in suburbs. So these same metropolitan areas are still where a majority of the US population lives today, but most people within those regions live in suburbs. The key difference being that while a huge majority of both white people and people of color live in suburbs, it's in the case of white people, it's actually like a vast majority that live in suburbs. And so there was a big racial shift that happened between 1950 and 2018, where cities went from being majority white to majority people of color, which is what they are today. And so folks on this particular discussion might be interested to see what this looked like specifically for our metro area, for the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. So that's what I'm showing on this graph. And so this is a particularly striking case that is, among the more unusual patterns for the US cities in this kind of top 50 group. What we see here is that today, DC is actually still smaller than it was in 1950 in terms of population. And that while our region has grown tremendously, that growth by and large has passed the District of Columbia by and has instead been concentrated in the suburban counties of the DC metro area. And so that we arrive here at a situation where once again, the vast majority of both white people and people of color live in suburbs such as Montgomery County. But once again, where DC was a majority white jurisdiction in 1950, today DC is majority Black and brown. So, the big picture for this is that what this shows is it looks like the suburbs are really diverse, and they are very diverse in the aggregate, but because of the overall timeline of suburbanization, in which the US white population migrated to the suburbs sooner than most people of color, right? Which is what we saw on this previous slide here, that in 1950, the suburbs already existed, but they were almost all white. So essentially, because white people got to the suburbs first, what we see is that white people and people of color, by and large, do not live in the same suburbs. And so we do see that also in our region. Sorry, just a second, sweetie. Mama's doing a meeting right now.
I know, but Dad had to throw away the paint pens because...
Can't help you, sweetie. Take it up with Dada.
Daddy doesn't...
Ooh, sorry, guys. It's just another evening in the Lowe household.
All good, all good.
Okay, so where was I? All right, so white people and people of color by and large don't live in the same suburbs. And so what has happened with suburbanization is that we essentially are still existing in the mostly segregated society that we had in 1950, but the spatial scale of segregation has dramatically increased. So we don't just live in segregated neighborhoods, we now live in what are by and large segregated jurisdictions. So Montgomery County actually though is a rare exemption to this. While it's largely segregated at the neighborhood level, it is a rare suburban jurisdiction that at the aggregate level is integrated. Okay, so let's take a look at, so this is from my most recent piece of research looking at segregation and why segregation is so persistent given that many forms of overt racial discrimination are now illegal, and given that there are many programs such as inclusionary zoning that attempt to kind of directly intervene and reduce segregation. It's really striking how persistent segregation has been over time, given how many people have tried to do something about it. And so I did a research project looking at housing inventory, the types of houses that are found in neighborhoods, to see if there was a relationship between the physical form of housing supply and how racially diverse neighborhoods are. So before I show you the kicker results on the relationship between the form of housing and integration, let's start by just looking at what's going on with housing inventory. So what we see on this graph is that the vast majority of neighborhoods in the United States are mostly composed of single-family homes, and that's actually true even in sort of urban core areas. So even when you think about the cities that are at the heart of metropolitan regions, what we see is that 47% of neighborhoods, even within cities, in the urban core, are majority single-family housing. And so, to me, this really speaks to kind of the sort of striking level at which, like, the built environment, once something is built, it takes a very long time for it to change. And change in the built environment is just very, very slow. And things that are built in the United States tend to persist for a really long time. But I think it is also interesting to note here that, like, our assumptions about kind of what the word urban means and what the word suburban means, those assumptions, there actually isn't as much of a difference between urban and suburban as we might think, right? Because if 47% of urban neighborhoods are majority detached single-family homes, it's also interesting to note that 23% of suburban neighborhoods are already majorly diverse in terms of the housing inventory that they have. So, there are some common things that people need from their places, regardless of how close to downtown they might happen to live. And these things, there is a lot of common ground between urban and suburban that I think speaks to the kind of universalness of the human need for shelter. So that's a big part of what I see on this graph. But the reason why, this relates to diversity is because, while the built environment is changing very slowly, our society in other ways is changing really rapidly. So the other graph that I wanted to share with everyone tonight is to just show how this is just covering the period from, sorry, I need my glasses, 1968 to 2019. So what we see on this graph is that in this time period, which is, also covers most of the time period of suburbanization, that there was a really drastic shift in the types of households that young people are forming. So this graph only covers people who are aged 23 to 38. So in 1968, people who were in 1968, aged 23 to 38, the vast majority of them were in households where they were married and they had at least one child. So that was 70% of people who were aged 23 to 38 in 1968. In 2019, we would refer to people who were those ages as millennials in 2019. And those people are clearly not forming the same types of household arrangements as their parents who were that age in 1968. Now, less than a third of millennials are married with a child. And instead, we see these big increases in every other type of household formation that you could think of. So there's been this really dramatic change that has happened at the same time as suburbanization. The problem being that does produce a really big mismatch between the kinds of housing inventory that we built and the kinds of households that we have. So this is one way in which this kind of, this new diversity of types of households is something that we are still trying to figure out how to accommodate in communities that we started building back in the 50s. And, it's a messy process, the musical chairs that we play with houses as generations change. And, another thing I want to note is that it isn't just the built environment that changes really slowly. We as families and as households change really slowly because life expectancy is increasing and our lives are longer and longer, which is a good thing. But that does mean that when you combine a slowly changing built environment with the fact that the vast majority of single family homes are owner occupied and that owners tend to move very infrequently, you can end up with really entire neighborhoods where there are just very limited opportunities for anyone new who doesn't already live in that neighborhood to move in. And so, this is part of my hypothesis about why segregation is so persistent. I don't personally believe that it's all because of overt racial malice or a desire on the part of different racial groups to live separately. I think that even though our country, like nationally, has become far more racially diverse and the types of households that we form have become far more diverse, I think it's just that our built environment and we as individuals just change a lot slower than those other changes have happened. And so there's just a mismatch between our ability to adapt and the pace of change. But the outcome of that, and now I'll show you the findings of my study on the relationship between housing inventory and racial diversity, is that neighborhoods that have more diverse types of homes in them are far more racially diverse than neighborhoods that have only one kind of home. So what I'm showing on this graph on the left, in the leftmost column, you see neighborhoods that are less than 50% detached single family housing. Those are the most racially diverse types of neighborhoods in the United States. Whereas all the way over on the right, we see neighborhoods that are more than 80 or even more than 90% detached single family homes. And those neighborhoods are the least racially diverse neighborhoods in the United States. So to recap, homeowners don't move very often. And that means that neighborhoods dominated by homeowners change very slowly. And that can even create kind of a separate reality in terms of expectations about how much change is normal. White people, especially older white people, are far more historically likely to live in such separation. And so that can create a mismatch between our national reality in terms of racial demographics, age demographics, and the reality on the ground in specific neighborhoods. I think I'd love to talk with the panel about the bigger picture in terms of why should the suburbs have to change? I do think that there's a lot of good reasons why it's primarily urban cores that should do a lot of changing. But at this point, the suburbs are where the vast majority of Americans live. And so especially inner ring suburbs of inelastic cities, so cities that cannot annex, these suburbs are already urbanizing. And so the question is really, for whom are they urbanizing? It's not really on the table whether they will urbanize or not, because it's already happening. So I'm looking forward to discussing that with my fellow panelists, and now I'll yield the floor.
All right, thank you very much, Tracy. That was great.
Sorry about the temper tantrum.
Oh no, totally fine. And if you need to go attend to that, we completely understand.
There are so many men in my house right now that it should be looking into that.
Yes, well, that's good. I'm glad that there is somebody there so that we can keep you here with us to answer more questions about your amazing research. for now, let's see, I will remove that pin there on you and go to our next speaker, who is Ben Kraft. This will be our final presentation. And so I know that the participants of this webinar tonight have gotten a lot of information thrown at you. So take a moment to pause and maybe soak that in. We'll have a chance to sort of dive into, you know, what are the implications of all of this in just a little bit. But I'm really excited for you all to see the really recent research that Ben Kraft has done with Montgomery Planning about neighborhood change. He is a research planner in the Research and Strategic Projects Division of Montgomery Planning, and his research and planning work focuses on topics related to the economy and employment. Ben has a PhD in city and regional planning from Georgia Tech and a master's degree in urban planning from the University of Michigan. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Ben, to round out our presentations here. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jane. Let me bear with me while I fumble with my getting my presentation up. And my partner and little one just arrived home, so I might rival Tracy with household theatrics. We'll see. Hopefully not. So anyway, yes, thanks for allowing me to share this research that I've been working on about neighborhood change in the Montgomery County and the DC region. And I think it's really, I'm glad that this is a neighborhood diversity, panel webinar, because it really did get me thinking about this research that I've been doing in the context of really just neighborhood diversity. So I'm just going to start with what I hope everybody listening or watching will leave with today, which is, just these main points. And really primarily it's that building infill and affordable housing enables socioeconomic diversity and prevents poverty, concentration, and displacement. That's kind of like the overall message here. And to just unpack that a little bit, first, this first point here, poverty concentration is a bigger problem than displacement in Montgomery County. We've been kind of, if you've seen any of our research or been to our webpage about this, we've been, this has been kind of the main headline, which I think is important because we do tend to think about, when we're thinking about how neighborhoods change, we tend to think about it as displacement or gentrification as the main big problem that needs to be solved. And to be sure, that is a problem. It does exist in Montgomery County, but numerically speaking, poverty concentration is the bigger problem and something that we really need to be worried about. And it is related to housing too, and I think the larger point here, it would be bullet number 2, where poverty, constant, and displacement, which I think really are actually just two sides of the same neighborhood change coin. And they're both driven by a lack of socioeconomic diversity within neighborhoods. They're really just what happens when neighborhoods become too homogeneous, one way or another. And another key insight related to that I think that this framework for researching neighborhood change highlights is that neighborhoods can get wealthier and more socioeconomically diverse. These two things can happen at the same time, even though I think most of the time when we think about it, I am included in this, tend to just like kind of by default say, well, if things get, quote unquote, better in this neighborhood, if it becomes more prosperous, then it's we're just looking at, displacement or gentrification, there would be no place for any of the people who are already there. And that's now, of course, that does happen in most cases, but it's not the way it has to be. And again, I think housing has to do with that. And so I say neighborhoods can do this, get wealthier and be more socioeconomically diverse, but not without growth. The only way that those two things can coexist is by basically adding housing to make room for a more diverse set of people. So, just to kind of sum that up, building more housing is key to preventing displacement and poverty concentration and fostering socioeconomically inclusive communities. So very quick background here on this research. It really, the idea is not mine. I can't claim credit for it. It was actually developed. The methodology for looking at neighborhood change or quantifying neighborhood change this way was really pioneered by a group at the University of Minnesota a couple of years ago, and they have a report called American Neighborhood Change in the 21st Century. It got a little bit of press in DC, and that's actually because Washington, DC, the city itself, was found to be the most intensely gentrifying place in the United States. But the thing that I guess obscures a bit is that those levels of displacement, gentrification, I'm using them interchangeably here. They're probably not interchangeable. And we can discuss that later, but that's also a lot to unpack. But such intense levels of displacement or gentrification are actually rare, and they happen mainly in cities like Washington, D.C., New York, Boston, Los Angeles, the large, coastal thriving cities. And in fact, across the nation, poverty concentration is a bigger problem. And this is actually true even in the DC region, what their research and my just kind of update to it found, which is that Montgomery County actually has more of a problem with poverty concentration than DC does. Than displacement. It has a much bigger problem with that than DC. So really all I did was we kind of took these metrics and really just, I think they ended at looked at what happened between 2019 and 2000 and 2019. We updated it so that it's they did 2000 to 2016. We updated it so that it's 2000 to 2019 and made a couple other little methodological tweaks, but really just focused in on the Washington, D.C. Area while this previous study was national. So I'm going to try to explain how the methodology works. So this is where I need everybody to kind of concentrate and just really do their best, because I have to explain this kind of complicated methodology on this also very complicated slide in about a minute and a half. So bear with me, and hopefully this will stick. But so what this methodology does is just look at the change in census tracts from how it was in 2000 versus how it was in 2019, based on the change in the population of one specific variable, and that is the number of people, really the number in percent of people at above or below 200% of the federal poverty level. This is just basically a census statistic. If you're middle high income, if you're above it, if you're above 200% of the federal poverty level, you are considered low income. I'm saying for the context of this study, you are considered low income if you are below it. So you can consider, so this really just gauges the shift in both of those populations within a census tract, in this case, which is standing in for a neighborhood. So you can be, if you're low income, you can be like the low income population. You can think of it as this axis. The middle high income population you can think of as the horizontal axis here. And so what you can immediately see here is that inclusive growth, keep this color scheme in mind if you can also. Inclusive growth is really is possible if you have growth of both low income population and growth of middle high income population. This happens. It's not incredibly common, but it does happen. On the other hand, if you have growth of middle high income population and decline, and at the same time decline of low income population, then that means you've got displacement. You've got middle high income people coming in at the expense of low income people. At the other kind of the mirror image of that, if you've got a growth in low income population and a decline in middle high income population, you've got basically, you've got low income concentration, and you've got low income people coming in and essentially, at the expense of middle high income population, although that's probably not displacement, because I think many of those moves would be voluntary. Finally, there's abandonment. And this is when you have declines of both populations. We don't have this in DC because we're just growing everywhere. So where we have increasing poverty concentration, it's going to be low income concentration. Abandonment's a problem in the Rust Belt and the depopulating rural areas of the country. And just one other caveat is the middle high income variable. There's a couple, there's a criteria that it has to meet. So not every tract is going to meet it. So most tracts will in fact not fit into one of these categories. So I'm just going to try to go quickly through so we can get a look of where the where these general geographic pattern for where these types of categories exist in the region. And so the thing with displacement is that it's, as I've kind of noted before, it's mostly in the DC and Arlington and Alexandria area. There is some in Montgomery County, but just not, but really the epicenter of this is Washington, DC. Note that there is some in the kind of rural areas. Just obviously there's a lot fewer people in these large splotches of blue than there are in these small splotches of blue in the city center. That's just kind of one of those geographical disparities that it looks worse than it is in a sense because just the area is bigger, but there's fewer people. At the same time, you can kind of see where that area, when we look at low income concentration, the displacement areas empty out, and you see kind of the eastern crescent surrounding those areas that become the areas where the low income concentration is. And there's some areas that will be familiar to Montgomery County residents, people. Germantown, Gaithersburg areas, Montgomery Village, areas around Aspen Hill and Fairland Briggs Cheney and Tacoma Langley those are the areas that we see are most severe low income concentration. Finally, there is some inclusive growth. The thing about inclusive growth, there's of course not very much of it, but it does tend to be present. Here's downtown Silver Spring. There's a bit of Wheaton, Rockville, and downtown Bethesda. So it's where our main transit-oriented regions are, or transit-oriented hubs, and it's effectively the only places we've really built housing of any import in the last 20 years. Here's just the map where you can see everything together, and note that again, most tracts actually don't fit the criteria of neighborhood change. This is just this next complicated slide really just shows the point of this is to show, well, it shows the number of tracts in each of these major jurisdictions in the region that are in any of these neighborhood change categories. So red, again, is low income concentration, blue is displacement, green is inclusive growth. And so the point here is that Montgomery County and Prince George's County have more tracts that are experiencing low income concentration than they do displacement. And that is flipped, and not just flipped, but very severely flipped when you look at Washington, D.C., Arlington, and Alexandria City. They have way more tracts that are experiencing displacement than low income concentration. So there's a regional disparity there, the central city to the suburbs. This chart is really just showing the same thing, but showing not the number of tracts that are affected, but rather the number of people that are affected. And without belaboring it, the red is higher than the blue in Prince George's and Montgomery. For the rest of the region, the blue is much higher than the red. So again, just that regional disparity of Maryland suburbs facing low income concentration, city, DC, Alexandria, and Arlington, really facing this displacement problem. This chart shows the racial and ethnic breakdown of each type of neighborhood change category. The left is the region not including Montgomery, the right is Montgomery County. And really there's a lot of things going on in this chart, but I guess for just the one to pay attention to here is the idea that our displacement, Montgomery County's displacement patterns are a lot different than that of the region as a whole. The region as a whole has this kind of traditional influx of whites displacing a lot of blacks and a little bit the Latinos. The Latino population just grew everywhere in every type of tract all over the region over these years. So it's not a surprise that they're kind of highest, but they did kind of grow most in the low-income concentration tracts. But at any rate, it's more of a traditional white displacing, Black pattern in the rest of the region. Whereas in Montgomery County, very few whites came into the displacement tracts, while not quite as large a proportion of Blacks left them. And actually, our Latino population grew the most in our displacement tracts in Montgomery County. So it's just a different pattern there than what's in the rest of the region, racially and ethnically. And finally, so how does housing fit into all this? So the green tracts, the inclusive growth tracts, just have there's no other way to say it, but way more housing per tract than any of the other types of tracts. So the top is the region, how this stat works out for the region. The bottom is how this stat works out for Montgomery County. And either way you look at it, there's just orders of magnitude more housing per tract in the inclusive growth tracts that have been built over this time period than there are in any of the other kind of tracts. In the low-income concentration tracts, it should be no surprise, because of just disinvestment as they grow poorer, have by far the least housing. So again, this isn't causal research or anything, but I think it makes a strong case that building housing is pretty strongly associated with this inclusive type of growth. Just to illustrate that with a tract that I think a lot of us are familiar with, downtown Silver Spring, which shows up as the most, I guess, I don't want to say severe, but the I don't know, best example of the strongest numerical example of inclusive growth in the entire DC region. No other, well, I didn't get into the subcategories, but really no other tract registers this strong as an inclusive growth tract. And you can see how many more housing units, it gained over 4,000 housing units over this time period. And its neighbors that are generally single family, except for this, this red tract to the southeast or southwest, excuse me, added far fewer housing units than downtown Silver Spring did. And so I think this has a lot to do with why downtown Silver Spring was able to add both, middle high income and low income people at the same time. And just as a addendum to that, it increased also quite equitably on the racially and ethnically also. So while it did add over 2,200 white residents over this time period, but it also added over 2,200 Black residents. And at this point, or as of 2019, downtown Silver Spring still had the largest single share of any racial or ethnic group was Black residents. Now, is this the most, this isn't the most common, root of neighborhood change, obviously, but I think it shows that it is possible to have diverse neighborhoods as long as we consider, that housing and really affordable housing, a lot of our affordable housing policies in Montgomery certainly had a lot to do with this. But it's possible to create these kind of communities if we have the right housing policies and build enough housing. And so I'll just end with a quote just to tie it all back into Thrive. So this is from the current draft that was in front of the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee that I think sums this vision up, which is, as we seek a future that is more equitable and inclusive, improved access to infrastructures and amenities in racially, socially, and economically isolated areas will not be enough. In other words, we can't just kind of build, add trees and parks and think that's going to kind of do the trick. We must also facilitate the integration of neighborhoods by race and income across all ages. Increasing the share of racially and economically mixed neighborhoods and schools across all parts of the county is critical to ensure that the inequities of the past will not be perpetuated in the future. So that is, I think maybe that's a good spot to leave it. And, we've got all the data is freely available to the public to play with. We've got a website for the project, and I can turn it back over to Jane for the rest of the discussion.
All right, thank you so much, Ben. That was great and super interesting research. So I'm glad that we're getting to share it with more folks. All right, I've got all the speakers pinned up now, so hopefully everyone can see them. And we're going to begin our Q&A. So I'm going to turn on the chat function so that people can put their questions there while I ask some questions in the meantime. Like I said before, that's a lot to process, a lot of really interesting information about how cities have changed over time, how Montgomery County and the DC region has specifically changed over time, where we are, what we need for the future, looking at the housing indicator tool, the lack of housing units that we have. So I think for my first questions, we had some of the policy implications at the end from Ben and from his research about the importance of housing and adding new housing into neighborhoods. And if you want to add more into that, I'll let you do so, Ben. But I think first to go to Tracy and LaToya to hear about what are the policy implications of the research that you presented, if you can expand a little bit more on that. Since we don't have a ton of time, I'll lump in as well. What role do local governments have in policies that support more diverse neighborhoods versus the state or federal government? So Tracy, would you want to start?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that, Ben's presentation was actually kind of a great exclamation point to immediately follow mine. I mean, I think the main policy implication, that I see in my research is that, if we want integrated, diverse neighborhoods, then we have to build housing. And, I would say, in particular, there's a shortage of multifamily housing, but building new housing of all types, can help address this. And, I think separately from that, there is a need to continue to address forms of overt discrimination in the kind of process and ecosystem by which people find housing. So that's everything from racial bias in home appraisals and home lending to steering by real estate agents, to school enrollment related moratoria. There are a lot of policy levers that and kind of process and market levers too that end up going into essentially deciding who can live where. Like, for example, I think that we need reform of how credit scores are calculated. And that, until some of this bigger picture stuff in which the private sector also plays a really huge role, until we see reform in these areas, I don't believe that we'll become an integrated society. So it is not all on government, federal or local. I think it's, when I'm presenting my research, my usual message is actually that it's on all of us as individuals, but it's also on the private sector. And that there's a great deal of reform that's needed across the whole ecosystem in order to get to the desired outcome.
And just to add on to that, echo everything that you just said, Tracy, I would even add on to that if we think about all of the things that revolve around housing, but we don't think about, like wages, jobs, locations of jobs, types of jobs that are being made available, and even who we're funneling, and I do say funneling, into some of those jobs versus who we're not funneling into some of those jobs. Are we looking at locating jobs where the people are? Are we looking at creating opportunities for diverse groups of people to be able to access those jobs, to access training opportunities? Are we paying wages that actually allow people to access housing closer to where they work so that they then aren't incurring more expensive transportation costs because of a commute? Are we providing adequate healthcare? And again, this all ties into, private sector decision-making, but even, local policy decision-making, and whether that's paid family leave, other insurance or health-related requirements. It is that whole universe of things for which housing is a really core component, because there's a lot of policy decisions that often get made that stem back to housing, but may not directly be housing decisions.
And Ben, did you want to add anything onto that?
Sure. Yeah. I mostly agree with I think everything that's been said. I'm probably a little less maybe optimistic about the impact that the private sector mechanisms for ameliorating this problem will make. While I do think all those things are, the things that Tracy mentioned with lending and steering and all those things are definitely important. To me, the fundamental problem is just, and as LaToya was mentioning, it's really wages are not high enough for most people to simply afford the cost of what it is to build housing and land, especially even though housing construction costs are going up a lot. So the mismatch between wages and housing, which I think is largely a federal issue, and also as LaToya noted, the just immense lack of housing to begin with, which again, I don't think local governments just don't really have the funds or financial abilities necessary to fund the volume of housing that really would be necessary to make a large impact. I mean, 374,000 units. I mean, that's a lot of money, and 77% of them, I guess, being affordable. It's a lot of money. That's a lot of continued money to maintain that affordability, which I just don't think it's something that local governments can do. So that requires, as has been talked about recently, but we may not see it, a large federal investment. But then I do think at the local level, I think the most direct thing that local governments can do, and planning organizations like mine, is pave the way for, if you really want to diversify neighborhoods, then put housing that allows diverse sets of people to move into neighborhoods that are not diverse. And that means putting affordable housing and different types of housing, missing middle types of housing, in areas that currently don't have them. That would be the quickest way that I can see to do this, rather than, as what we usually do, find the areas that already have a lot of affordable housing and put more affordable housing there. That's not going to diversify neighborhoods. That's going to further concentrate poverty.
I think that also, you sort of touched on another question that I had, so I won't go too deep back into that, but about how important is housing on its own, and what is housing connected to or not connected to. As somebody who cares about housing, I of course want to think that it's the center of the universe, but oftentimes wages and these bigger policies about the economy and so many other things are important to create the outcomes that we want to see. But I think what you were saying towards the end there, Ben, goes into another question that I wanted to ask. We're talking a lot about what needs to change in neighborhoods, and that change can be really scary, especially if you really like and potentially benefit from the way that things currently are. So what does implementing these policy ideas mean for a long-time homeowner? And then also, what do implementing these policies mean for a renter? Anyone can start.
That's a great question. So I did, as part of the research project that I did, looking at the relationship between housing inventory and I looked at both race and income diversity. I did a literature review of the existing evidence about how the construction of multifamily housing impacts the value of single-family homes that are nearby. And what I found is that the majority of the literature finds that there is either no impact, or that single-family home values actually increase because of because there may be increased development potential for the land that the single-family home is on, or just because the home is now located in an area where there are more people represent a bigger market that can sustain more amenities. So So I generally think that while I hear all the time, from people that that growth and change are things that can feel uncomfortable or are undesired or not expected. The net benefits of them, the net benefits of change, can actually benefit even incumbents.
I would also add in, one of the things that we often talk about at hand is helping people think about how policies may not only impact you now, but how they might impact you in decisions that you need to make around your housing in the future, whether the future is 5 years from now or 25 years from now. Jane, to your question, thinking about homeowners, one of the things that we think about when we talk about affordability policies, that's also a very real issue in neighborhoods that are where housing costs are rapidly increasing, is someone's long-term ability to stay in their home as a homeowner, particularly as you age, particularly as your income might go down. And depending on what you have in terms of retirement income, in terms of savings, in terms of your financial ability to stay in that home, having, for example, policies in place that address homeownership affordability, that address property tax abatements. Those are all things that people don't always think about when we talk about the affordability issue. When we think about rental policies, I think to some of the points that were already raised, the ability for affordability policies to ultimately create more supply, particularly in areas of activity, transit hubs, transit centers, dense or high activity nodes. By creating that housing, you're also creating these other amenities, these other resources, which increases supply, which then increases more options for people to be able to access housing. It also increases not just more options in general, but more options along a broader spectrum of affordability. So I think particularly as we think about how people move across the housing continuum, how they move from even being a renter in a 3-bedroom apartment with a bunch of roommates, how they move from that to maybe buying their first condo, to then ultimately buying a house if they want to do that in the future. All of these policies relate to one person's ability to be able to move economically across that spectrum.
Yeah, for the longtime homeowner, this is a really tough one, and I don't know if I have a great answer for it, except to say that, well, first of all, I think a lot of it's helpful to remind people that none of these policies are taking anyone's actual home. Although it sometimes, with the pushback, it seems like it almost seems like that's what we're suggesting. But none of these policies do take property from anyone that we're suggesting, or that would increase the housing stock. And beyond that, I guess I would just have to make an appeal that if and this can go to a specific set of people. It's not every longtime homeowner, but if you've paid off your mortgage, or if you're about to pay off your mortgage, your mortgage payment is not going to change, these days, because adjustable rates are, kind of don't happen much anymore. You've got, if you're in Montgomery County, you've probably got a lot of equity in your house, which, I know it's still not ideal. If you see your neighborhood changing around you, you may not like that, and you may really, feel very strongly for however many reasons that you want to stay in your place. But at the very least, if you've got that equity, you've got choices. And they might not be the ideal choices, but they're choices. And what building housing, more housing will do, possibly in somebody's neighborhood, will give other people choices that they currently don't have. What people are struggling with is just lack of really any sort of housing related choice, and really just just essentially being forced to do something. So that's kind of the only appeal I can make. And I don't know that that's how effective that is, but that's kind of where I get stuck with that. And obviously for renters, I mean, the best having landlords compete, I think is probably better for renters than, any sort of static policy that a local government could come up with that will give some sort of assurances until that law somehow gets changed. But I think the more housing that's available, just the automatically the better that becomes for renters.
Great, thank you all. My last question before I jump to some of the audience questions will be, where does the research need to go next? What don't we know? Anyone?
Oh, that's a good one.
Because we don't know everything, right? There's still more out there to learn.
I think though, I do think like where Tracy was going with her looking at housing typologies, and how that relates to neighborhood diversity is really important, because it would help us. I mean, that is, we have some things going on in that vein also, but I really do think that would help us to deter, first of all, just illustrate this idea of missing middle housing that we haven't really talked about here today, but except just kind of like in passing, but the fact that we need different types, not just single family housing and large multifamily buildings, but townhouses, duplexes, all kinds of, a whole range of housing that people could, that would provide nice trade-offs, kind of cost space trade-offs for people that currently don't exist. And if we could see where diversity of housing stock is correlated with diverse neighborhoods, I really do think that would help a lot. I think also one of the things that it's very hard to, I don't know who's familiar here with the research by Raj Chetty. He's just his team with looking at opportunity in the United States is just like pumping out research paper after research paper about basically what they're looking at as neighborhood effects of poverty. What does it really take to help people that are kind of like stuck in poverty, rise out of that? And what we're seeing from that research, at least, is that the main thing that you can do is get people out of concentrated poverty. But the problem is it's very hard to, the only way you can really research that and hold things constant is to actually see what happens when people leave neighborhoods. It's very hard to research what happens if, for neighborhoods changing around people and how that might help people. And it'd be great to know. I don't know exactly how to tackle that research, but it would be great to be able to do that and learn from it.
Yeah, I agree with Ben. I'm pretty convinced by the existing body of evidence, not to flatter myself about my own research, but I feel like I've answered a lot of the big questions that I had about segregation when I was first starting my career. And I think we're at a point where I have become uncomfortable with how strong the evidence base is for what we could do to reduce segregation and how little we do to actually implement those things that we know work. I view that as a real problem. And while as a researcher, it's tempting for me to say, here are XYZ additional research things that I am excited about doing, I personally doing something about segregation is kind of the motivating force for like my entire life. and so I, at this point, am not comfortable saying that what's needed is more research. That said, to Ben's point, I agree that, his research and this research in this group, the University of Minnesota, what's so interesting about it is just what a rare unicorn inclusive growth is. Because one of the reasons why there is an enormous amount of political opposition to acting on what we know would would reduce segregation is because of the fear of, out of an attempt to promote integration, that instead we would promote displacement. Right. So this is a huge concern, I mean, especially in progressive philanthropy, but this is a big concern for a lot of communities. And frankly, it is a valid concern. And so this is an area where more research is needed in order to make sure that we do not walk into somebody else's kitchen and light a fire in their oven. So, I think that is something that I'm interested in doing more work on. I have been working with a couple of collaborators, and we have a paper coming out from my center at Brookings in September that looks at what we call indicators associated with inclusive growth. We identified 200 neighborhoods in cities across the United States that have experienced the inclusive growth that Benjamin described. And then we did basically like a big data mining exercise to identify variables that are highly associated with inclusive growth outcomes in order to generate some more hypotheses about what the drivers of inclusive growth are and how local leaders can design new policy interventions that can start to get at some of these other dimensions, or to LaToya's point that this is about more than housing, because it truly is. For example, like in this, I'm just going to cheat and tell you guys a little bit about what's in this paper that's coming out in September. One of the other things that is really important in driving inclusive growth is that one of the indicators that it's strongly associated with is low rates of gun violence. And given what's happening with gun violence in the United States right now, this is a major issue, not just for personal safety and security, which I think, everybody feels that it's an issue for that. But it truly is also an issue for people who care about doing something about poverty. And because it's highly associated with specific places. So I think that asking some of these kind of like bigger research questions about what shapes inclusive growth and how to make it happen is something that researchers can do that would be helpful to policymakers. And that is something that I'm working on.
Well, that is really exciting to have that preview, and I will eagerly await that paper's publication. It sounds like there will be a lot to learn there. I'm definitely proud to learn from Ben's research that I live in one of those neighborhoods that has had the inclusive growth in downtown Silver Spring, and that we have that local example it'll point to, but it'll be really exciting to be able to see across the country other places to potentially learn from. So with that, we only have a few minutes left, so I want to try to get to as many of the audience questions as possible, although I think hopefully some of those questions have been answered throughout this process. Like hopefully, Allison, your question about, what are the most important things to advocate for, building more housing, anything else? Hopefully we'll find more about the anything else when that paper is published. Could I have one person in just one sentence explain the difference between displacement and gentrification in very simple terms? A fun challenge.
Well, I can't definitively, explain the difference, but I can explain what I maybe think is the difference in when people actually talk about it.
One sentence, Ben.
So displacement is just the numerical, it's just quantitative. People get, pushed out. You can measure that. The gentrification idea is the cultural component of it, which can happen, which does not necessarily correlate with. That can happen in what my research was showing was inclusive growth tracts or neighborhoods. It can also happen there. That wasn't one sentence. Sorry.
All right, we'll take it.
Mumbling in several sentences.
The next question is, what do the panelists think about eliminating zoning to achieve inclusive growth? Note, this question asker does not mean everywhere. He would still support having the ag reserve, but having no restrictions where we do allow development. Some quick thoughts on that.
I'll offer only because I'm taking off my hand who is one of my clients' hats, and putting on one of my other clients' hats. So I've been working down in the city of Charlottesville, Virginia for the last 2.5 years. For folks who are not familiar with what's happening down there, they are currently, for the last 2.5 years, they've actually been going through their own, I would say, land use universe of updates, including the update of their comprehensive plan, the development of an affordable housing strategy, and we actually are currently in the process of updating their zoning code to align with their comp plan. And there's several other jurisdictions across the country that are going through similar processes right now. To that particular question, just from what I've seen professionally, I would, personal opinion, professional opinion, I would say no to eliminating zoning, because we've seen areas, particularly in parts of Texas, where zoning has been eliminated and development gets a little willy-nilly, a little wild. What I think in terms of achieving inclusive growth, I think it's more about how are you strategic with the zoning that you're recommending, and how do you start to push the envelope on density through your zoning code. And then combining that more aggressive zoning code with other policies, because zoning is not the only thing, it's not the only tool that will solve for inclusivity. You need to have a whole package of things to address the inclusivity issue. So zoning is one piece of that, coupled with a really robust comp plan that speaks to what some of your municipality goals and objectives are, to meeting issues of affordability, issues of equity, issues of transportation, economic development, housing, et cetera, et cetera. And then also having some kind of a housing strategy that is speaking to the kinds of housing that you're trying to provide based on the need that you have and how you're going to pay for it. So it really is a bit of a package, but to that specific question, I would say no to eliminating and more to refining the zoning to be more robust, to start to meet those development and density objectives that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I would just like to affirm and second everything that LaToya said. What we see in places that basically don't have very much zoning is that they do actually have what I would call like de facto zoning, which is basically that homeowners associations and special improvement districts and other kinds of private or only quasi-public entities basically step into the vacuum and impose very zoning-like regulations that frankly empower incumbent property owners far more than a zoning regime that is regulated by a hypothetically democratic public sector. So, that is something that I think we just need to be smart and careful about. And I just don't think there is an absolutist right answer for especially for a genie that's already out of the bottle. I do think that, zoning is a really important tool for example, like prohibiting development in riparian areas, like, right next to water and streams and things like that. So I think there's a lot that we can do to streamline zoning and to use it appropriately as a tool. But it is one of the few and very powerful tools that local governments have at their disposal to achieve goals. And so I think what's more important is to more publicly and explicitly state what the goals truly actually are. Validate those, like have those affirmed by your elected, county council. And then have them appropriately implemented by your county government. I think that transparency is simply the way to go in terms of promoting more good government use of zoning.
So we're at 1 minute after 8:30. So I want to take a moment to thank each of our panelists for everything that they do to further us towards these goals, and for taking the time out of their schedules to speak with us tonight. Thank you to everybody for attending. This recording will be posted on Montgomery for All's YouTube channel. We do have one more question, if I could have like 3 more minutes maybe from the panelists to answer it, because it's our last question to get to, so I'd love to get to it. So really quickly here, this question asks, I'm a civic leader in the downtown Silver Spring area. How can my civic best present to our community that we have got to embrace inclusive growth when we're predominantly white-owned homeowners with large lots? We have to address what the desired outcomes need to look like and prepare our homeowners that we must embrace equity and change. And how can we get property owners who are sitting on vacant homes in our neighborhoods to sell, to increase our inventory to families who need and should be in our neighborhood? So that's a lot, but 2 questions there. How do we get property owners of vacant homes to sell? And how do we get people, I think we addressed this a little bit before about sort of how do we get people to embrace change, that it's a difficult thing to do. But maybe if you could talk a little bit about that second question there about getting property owners to sell.
I can jump in on the vacant property one really quick, just because I did serve for 2 years on the City Council of Mount Rainier, which is a very small municipality in Prince George's County. And while I served on that council, I passed Maryland's first vacancy tax on residential property. Prior to that, there was several municipalities had expressed interest, but there was a lot of ambiguity regarding how SDAT works, and just how things are run in Maryland at the state level in terms of taxation and whether it was possible. But we were able to clarify with the state that it is possible, and I am a proponent of vacancy taxes in the residential context.
And I saw nods from Ben and LaToya there as well.
I would echo that. DC has had a vacant property tax for quite some time now. And they have a very, I will say, very well-tuned and robust system for going around finding properties that seem to be vacant, abandoned, not being utilized, tagging them, and then very promptly assessing the property tax owner with an outrageous tax bill. And that has actually, to my own surprise, I'm saying this as someone who was from here originally and has seen the different iterations of DC's history, it has really spurred very prompt redevelopment of those houses, either those existing owners, whether it's the person who used to live there who left, or the children of a deceased owner coming back and either rehabbing the house and reoccupying it, or rehabbing it, selling it, or just putting it on the market and selling it to a flipper to let them redevelop it and put it on market. So it has certainly lit a fire under people.
In my personal experience, I mean, at least in the jurisdiction I was serving in, the majority of these vacant homes were actually bank owned.
Really?
I will be honest with you guys. The foreclosure crisis never ended in Prince George's County, and that is still a reality that we are dealing with. And, I had just in my little ward, I had bank owned homes that were vacant for years. And were not maintained and were turning into haunted houses. And this is an issue in other jurisdictions in Maryland. While the context in Montgomery County is obviously different, the point is that, Maryland is a little bit unusual in that the state administers the property tax database. And so that is extraordinary, but actually does align capacity kind of interestingly, for local jurisdictions that are willing to put in the work to, establish, to bifurcate these tax rates, and then to do the inspection work that LaToya described, which can be incorporated within an existing code enforcement ecosystem. It's something that is possible in Maryland.
Well, I'm super glad that I asked that question, because that was really interesting to hear both of your thoughts on that. And I'm seeing a ton of people in the chat who are thanking you for your fantastic presentations. Even somebody who says maybe we should build upon this webinar to do a conference. This is a topic that I care a lot about. So, hey, I'm up for that. But yes, again, thank you so much. This has been really fantastic. So I hope everybody has a great night and a great rest of your weeks. All right, take care.